The sun over Dakota Territory burned low and red, dragging its light across the endless plains like a dying ember on parchment. Dust followed the lone rider, a young woman in a faded blue dress, her bonnet pulled low, her hands trembling on the reins of a borrowed horse. Her name was Clara May Dalton, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in weeks. To most who glimpsed her silhouette along the horizon, she was just another drifter, another soul the frontier might swallow whole before sundown. But Clara wasn't wandering by choice. She was running, from a past that refused to stay buried and from a man who thought her too broken to be worth saving. The trail to Red Hollow Ranch stretched in silence. The wind carried the smell of sage and the faint hum of locusts. Clara's dress clung to her from sweat and dust, but her eyes, blue-gray and fierce, still held the stubborn light of someone not yet ready to give up. She'd heard stories in the last town about a ranch that hired women to cook and wash for the cowhands, and about a widowed cowboy who kept mostly to himself. She didn't care about gossip. All she wanted was work, food, and a roof that didn't leak. When she reached the gate, the ranch looked like something torn out of a dream. Fences stretched to the foothills where cattle grazed like freckles on gold skin. The barn doors were open wide, and the air hummed with the sounds of horses snorting, ropes creaking, and men calling orders across the corral. Clara hesitated, clutching her small satchel, the only thing she had left from the life she'd lost. Then a voice cut through the wind. "Ma'am, you lost?" She turned and saw him, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, his shirt rolled up at the sleeves, sweat glistening on his neck. His face was tanned by years of work under the sun, lined in ways that made him seem older, though his eyes were young, brown, steady, unreadable. He held a bridle in one hand, a coil of rope in the other, and something about his stillness unsettled her more than his stare. "I'm not lost," she said, forcing the words. "I heard you might be needing a cook." The man studied her, then glanced at the worn mare beneath her. "You came a long way for a pot and pan," he muttered. "I came farther for less," she replied, her voice dry as the dust beneath them. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he nodded toward the house beyond the barn. "You can talk to Mrs. Boone. She keeps the kitchen." "Name's Caleb Hart," he said, tipping his hat slightly. Here's my ranch." She thanked him and slid down from the horse, her legs stiff from the ride. Caleb caught the reins before the mare wandered off, and Clara noticed the quiet gentleness with which he stroked the horse's muzzle. It was an odd thing, how rough men out here handled beasts with more care than they did people. Inside the house, Mrs. Boone, a widow with a sharp tongue and kind eyes, looked Clara over from head to toe before agreeing to take her on for trial. "You look like you can boil beans and mend a shirt," she said. "That's all I need. Don't mind the men. They'll bark, but they don't bite. Not unless you ask them to." That night, Clara washed dishes until her fingers went numb. The men's laughter drifted from the porch, mingling with the soft drawl of Caleb's voice giving orders. Every time she caught his shadow in the doorway, her stomach tightened, though she couldn't say why. He never said much, never lingered, but there was something about the way he looked at her, like he saw through the dust and fear and wanted to know what story she wasn't telling. When the day's work was done, she sat on the back steps, gazing at the prairie stretching into forever. The wind carried the scent of rain and horses, and for the first time in months she felt still. But peace was a fragile thing out here, easily broken by a memory, and Clara's memories came like ghosts when the world grew quiet. Her mind drifted back to the town she'd fled, the saloon with its red lamps, the laughter of men who'd bought more than whiskey, and the man who'd promised her safety before he'd taken everything she owned. She'd trusted him, and he'd sold her trust for the price of a saddle. When she'd run, she'd left behind her pride, her home, and the only family that might have still cared. A door creaked behind her, and Clara stiffened. Caleb stepped out, his boots soft against the wood. "You've been at it all day," he said quietly. "You should rest." "I can't sleep," she murmured. He leaned against the post beside her, arms crossed. "The prairie's loud when it's quiet, ain't it? Makes a person think too much." Clara nodded but said nothing. The silence between them stretched, not awkward but heavy, full of something unspoken. When she finally looked up at him, she found his gaze on the horizon, not her. The dying sun threw gold on his face, softening the hard lines there. "Mr. Hart," she said finally, "why do you let strangers work here?" He shrugged. "Everybody's a stranger out here. Some just stop running sooner than others. His words struck something in her chest, a place she'd kept locked tight. She wanted to ask more, to tell him she wasn't sure she'd ever stop running, but he pushed away from the post and started toward the barn. "Tomorrow will come early," he said, glancing back. "You'll learn the rhythm soon enough." When he disappeared into the dark, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't know it yet. But that night marked the beginning of something neither of them would forget. A quiet pull between two broken souls who'd forgotten what it meant to feel safe. And somewhere deep inside her, for the first time in years, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't meant to run forever. The days that followed melted into one another like candle wax in the heat. At dawn, the ranch came alive. Horses snorting, hooves pounding against the packed earth, men shouting across the corral while the sun dragged itself over the horizon. Clara rose before light, her hair twisted up beneath a kerchief, her hands already red from scrubbing and kneading. Every movement had its rhythm now. The hiss of coffee on the stove, the slap of wet laundry on the line, the soft creak of the house settling against the wind. She worked in silence most of the time, speaking only when spoken to. But she could always feel him nearby. Caleb Hart wasn't a man who talked much, yet his presence filled every corner of the ranch. The men respected him, not out of fear, but the way soldiers respect the one who walks into the storm first. They said he'd once had a wife and a baby who died of fever one winter. He never spoke of it. He rarely smiled, but sometimes Clara caught him watching her. It wasn't lust, not the crude, hungry look she'd learned to guard against in towns full of drunk cowhands and gamblers. His gaze was steadier, slower, curious, as if he was trying to figure out who she'd been before the dust and distance turned her into someone hard-edged. Each time their eyes met, something small and warm stirred in her chest. Dangerous warmth, the kind that could burn down the fragile shelter she'd built around her heart. One morning, while she was hauling water from the well, the rope slipped from her hand, splashing her skirt with cold. She muttered under her breath, pulling again. But the bucket caught on something deep below. Caleb, passing by with a saddle thrown over his shoulder, stopped. "Let me," he said simply. "I can manage." He studied her for a beat, then set the saddle down and took the rope anyway. His hands were rough but sure, the muscles in his forearms shifting like coiled ropes as he pulled. The bucket broke free, sloshing water over his boots. And he grinned, just barely, but it was enough to make her forget how to breathe. "Seems the well's got a temper," he said. Clara's lips twitched despite herself. "You should see me when I'm tired." He laughed, a sound so rare it startled even him. For a moment she saw not the rancher hardened by grief, but the man he might have been once, before loss carved its lines into him. After that, something between them changed, small things at first. Caleb started leaving extra firewood by the kitchen door before dawn. She began packing an extra biscuit or slice of pie for him when he rode out with the men. Neither spoke of it, but the gestures said what words didn't dare to. On the fourth evening after her arrival, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind came first, bending the grass flat, followed by thunder that sounded like God himself tearing the sky apart. The ranch hands ran for shelter, driving the cattle into the lower pens. Clara stood on the porch holding the doorframe as the first drops hit, hard, cold, relentless. Caleb came running from the barn, rain plastering his hair to his face. "Get inside," he called. "I need to pull the laundry," she shouted back, already halfway across the yard. "Leave it, Clara." But she didn't listen. The sheets whipped like ghosts in the wind, and before she could unpin them, the rope snapped, wrapping around her wrist. She stumbled, nearly fell, when strong arms caught her from behind. Caleb pulled her close, steadying her against his chest. The rain came down in sheets, soaking them both. For a moment neither moved. His breath warm against her ear, her heart hammering against his ribs. She could feel every beat of him, every ounce of strength holding her upright. "Reckless fool," he murmured, his voice low, rough, but soft in a way that made her knees weaken. "You said to leave it," she whispered. "Didn't seem right." He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You don't listen worth a damn." Clara looked up then, rain running down her cheeks, her bonnet gone, her hair plastered to her skin. The world around them blurred, just the two of them standing in the downpour, the ranch fading into gray. For a heartbeat she forgot the fear, the shame, the past. All she saw was the man who'd held her steady when everything else in her life had fallen apart. Caleb. She started, but her voice broke. Something flickered in his eyes, hesitation, longing, guilt. He released her slowly, as if letting go of something far heavier than her hand. "Get inside," he said again, quieter now. By the time the storm passed, the sky had turned the color of bruised violets. The house creaked, dripping from every gutter. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood and simmering stew. Caleb sat by the fire, his hat on his knee, staring into the flames. Clara stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching him. She wanted to thank him, for saving her, for being kind when he had no reason to be, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "You don't have to be so alone all the time." He looked up, his eyes unreadable. "You don't know what I have to be." "I know what it feels like to have nothing," she said. Their eyes met again, and the silence that followed said more than either dared to speak aloud. That night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Clara sat by her window watching lightning flicker across the distant plains. She thought of Caleb, of his hands, his quiet laughter, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. It scared her the way he made her feel, because she'd promised herself she'd never trust another man again. Not after what she'd lost, not after what had been taken from her. And yet when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the warmth of his arms in the rain. And for the first time, she wished morning would come faster. The storm had passed, but it left the world hushed, as though even the wind feared to disturb what had happened between them. For the next few days, Clara moved through the ranch like a ghost. The rain had soaked more than her dress. It had seeped into the cracks of everything she thought she'd buried. She'd come here to disappear, to be no one, to start again. But now she found herself glancing toward the corral whenever she heard Caleb's voice, her heart betraying her with its restless rhythm. The men joked that she'd brought the rain with her, that she was some kind of good luck charm for the herd. She smiled when they said it, but she didn't believe in luck. Not anymore. She believed in survival, and in the quiet ache that came every time Caleb's hand brushed too near hers at the supper table. He, too, had grown quieter. Not cold, but distant, as if he was fighting a battle no one else could see. He'd watch her from across the yard, his gaze shadowed, his jaw tight, and when she caught him, he'd turn away, pretending to fuss with a bridle or light his pipe. One evening, the air turned warm and soft after sunset, the sky painted in ribbons of pink and gold. The men had gone into town, leaving the ranch unusually quiet. Clara finished washing up, the smell of stew and soap still clinging to her hands. When she stepped outside, she saw Caleb by the fence, his back to her, watching the sun slip behind the hills. Something in her chest urged her forward. Maybe it was the loneliness that had followed her for so long. Maybe it was the simple human hunger for warmth. Or maybe it was the memory of his arms around her in the rain, steady and strong when the world had felt like it was crumbling. She walked up beside him, her boots crunching softly on the dirt. "You ever seen anything so pretty?" she asked, nodding toward the horizon. He smiled faintly. "Used to watch sunsets like that with my wife. She said the sky looked like God's quilt, stitched together out of all the prayers people forgot to say." Clara looked down, her throat tightening. She must have been kind. "She was," he said quietly. "Too kind for me. When she passed, I figured that was my punishment. God gives you something pure once, and if you break it, he don't hand you another." The words hung between them, heavy as dusk. Clara turned away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. "You don't strike me as a man who breaks things." He laughed under his breath, a low sound without humor. "You don't know me, Clara." "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I know what hurt looks like." The wind caught her hair, pulling it loose around her face. For a long time they stood in silence, the air humming with everything neither dared to say. Then Caleb reached out almost without thinking and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers lingered a second too long. Clara's breath caught. The warmth of his touch felt like sunlight through glass, gentle, dangerous, fragile. She looked up, and in that moment something shifted. The distance they'd built between them crumbled, quiet as a sigh. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is this wrong?" Her question hung there, soft but sharp, like a spark in dry grass. He didn't move, didn't speak. For a moment she thought he might step back, that he'd remind her she was just a worker and he was her employer, and that people like them had no right to want more. But he didn't. Instead, his hand slid from her cheek to her jaw, his thumb tracing the edge of her lips, his gaze dark with a sadness that looked too much like love. "Wrong," he murmured, his voice low, rough as gravel. "Maybe, but so's living half dead." She closed her eyes, the tears she'd fought for weeks finally breaking free. "I don't want to make another mistake," she whispered. "Then don't run from it this time," he said, stepping closer until their foreheads touched. His breath was warm against her skin, his words trembling with something that sounded like truth. "You ain't what happened to you, Clara. You're what you decide comes after." The world around them disappeared. The ranch, the fences, the ghosts of their past lives. There was only the sound of their hearts and the soft wind carrying the scent of wildflowers from the valley. She didn't know who moved first, only that his lips found hers in a kiss that was slow, aching, filled with everything they'd both lost and feared to want again. It wasn't the kind of kiss that demanded or claimed. It was the kind that promised. A trembling, fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, broken things could still fit together. When they finally pulled apart, she was shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. Caleb's hand rested against her back, steadying her. "Clara," he said softly, "if this is wrong, then I don't want to be right again." She laughed, a sound she hadn't made in so long it startled even her. The sky above them deepened into indigo, the first stars flickering to life. For the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger on someone else's land. She felt seen. That night, they sat together on the porch long after the moon had risen. Caleb told her about the son he'd lost, and she told him about the man who'd betrayed her. There were no lies, no hiding, only truth and the kind of quiet that feels like healing. When she finally stood to leave, he caught her hand gently. "You deserve peace," he said. She looked down at their joined hands and whispered, "Maybe I've found it." Inside, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Clara felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, not just from love, but from being alive again. And somewhere outside, under the vast and endless sky, Caleb whispered into the dark the words she wouldn't hear until much later. Words that would carry them both through every trial to come. "I ain't letting you go. Not again." The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows like gold dust. Clara hummed while stirring biscuits in the pan, the sound soft and content in her throat. It was strange, how one night could change the color of everything. Even the sound of the wind felt different, gentler somehow. But joy on the frontier was a fragile thing. The prairie always demanded a price. By mid-morning, the men were back from town. They came with supplies, gossip, and that watchful kind of silence that meant someone had said too much. Clara noticed, at first when they passed through the doorway, the quick glances, the smirks that didn't quite hide curiosity. She froze, the wooden spoon in her hand trembling. "Morning, Miss Dalton," one of the younger hands drawled, too casual. "Heard you and Mr. Hart been spending some late nights watching the stars." The room went still. Mrs. Boone, standing by the table, looked up sharply. "Mind your tongue, Jake," she snapped. "The lady's done nothing but work herself near to death since she got here." Jake shrugged, grinning. "Didn't mean no harm, ma'am. Just repeating what folks in town are saying. You know how talk spreads faster than tumbleweed." Caleb stepped in from the porch just then, the sunlight behind him turning his figure into shadow. His eyes moved from Clara to the men, and though he didn't say a word, the air changed. It went cold, heavy. "Anyone else got something they'd like to say?" His voice was low even, but it carried the kind of warning that came from years of being obeyed. No one answered. The young hand muttered something and busied himself with his hat. Caleb looked at Clara then. Their eyes met for only a second, but that second was enough. She saw the regret there, not for the kiss they'd shared, but for the pain the world would surely cause her because of it. After breakfast, she tried to lose herself in work, but the whispers had taken root. By noon, she'd heard the stable boy snicker something under his breath, and by sundown, she could barely step outside without feeling eyes on her back. That night, she sat by her small window, watching the lanterns flicker in the barn. Caleb was out there, alone as always, moving like a shadow between the stalls. She wanted to go to him to ask what would happen now, but fear coiled tight in her chest. The next morning, 2 riders came up the long dirt road, the preacher from town and his wife, faces pinched with righteousness. Mrs. Boone met them at the porch, but it was clear they hadn't come for her. "Where's the girl?" the preacher asked, his voice full of something that sounded like pity but cut sharper than any knife. "People are talking, Mrs. Boone. They say your new kitchen hand's been keeping improper company with Mr. Hart." Mrs. Boone's mouth pressed into a thin line. "And what business is that of yours, Reverend?" "The business of decency," he said stiffly. "This ranch represents the Lord's grace in our community. We can't have—" He didn't finish because Caleb had stepped out of the barn and was walking toward them. His shirt was dusty, his hat low over his eyes, but the calm in his stride was that of a man who'd already decided what he stood for. "You can stop right there, Reverend," he said. "Whatever you think you know, you don't." "Then say it plain, Mr. Hart," the preacher demanded. "Is there truth to what folks are saying? That you've taken a woman under your roof? For reasons not fit to speak in front of God?" Caleb's jaw worked, his eyes flicking once toward the house where Clara watched from behind the curtain. "She works for me," he said slowly. "She earns her keep same as anyone else here, that's all." The preacher's wife sniffed, unconvinced. "Then send her away. You're a man of means, Mr. Hart. You don't need the trouble she brings." For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that comes before a thunderstorm. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the only trouble I've had lately is folks sticking their noses where they don't belong." The preacher's face turned red. "You'll regret defying decency, Caleb Hart." "Maybe," Caleb said, stepping closer. "But I'll regret letting a good woman be run out of my house a hell of a lot more." The preacher sputtered, tugged at his reins, and rode off with his wife trailing behind him. When the dust settled, Caleb turned toward the window. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it from across the yard. She went to the door before she could stop herself, stepping out into the fading light. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I ain't gonna stand by while they talk about you like you're dirt," he said. "They'll talk worse now," she said, tears filling her eyes. "They'll say I'm ruining you." Caleb took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Let 'em. I've been ruined before. Didn't kill me then, won't kill me now." Clara shook her head. "You don't understand. I can't. I won't be the reason you lose everything you built." He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You think I care about the ranch? About some fool preacher's words, Clara? I care about you, about what's real." Her breath caught. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let that warmth swallow her whole, but the fear was louder. "You don't know what happens to women like me," she whispered. "The world don't forgive us, no matter how gentle the man beside us is." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "Then we'll make our own world," he said simply. "Right here, with what we got." That night they sat again on the porch, not speaking much. The sky was full of stars, the kind that looked close enough to touch. Caleb's hand found hers, and for the first time since she could remember, Clara stopped trembling. For all the talk and judgment and whispers, the ranch felt like the only honest place in the world. And when she looked at him, the man who'd risked his name to protect hers, she knew love wasn't a sin. It was a fight, and she was done running from it. Winter came to Red Hollow early that year. Frost silvered the fences and laced the barn roofs, and each morning the cattle's breath rose like ghosts in the dawn. The world had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the lonely quiet that once haunted Clara. It was the stillness of something mending, piece by piece. After the preacher's visit, half the town stopped coming by the ranch. Men who'd once traded cattle with Caleb took their business elsewhere. A few of the hands left too, muttering that a ranch run by a man soft on his kitchen girl wouldn't last the season. But Caleb never raised his voice or tried to chase anyone back. He just kept working, shoulders steady beneath the weight of it all. Clara tried to leave once. She packed her small satchel and stood by the road before dawn, the frost biting through her boots. But before she could climb the fence, she heard his voice behind her. "If you walk away now, Caleb said quietly. Don't come back for my sake. Come back 'cause you want to. She turned, tears stinging her cheeks. You deserve better than a woman the whole town calls ruined. He shook his head. Ain't no one in this world fit to judge ruin, Clara. Not when we're all just trying to survive it. And somehow, those words held her there. She dropped the satchel and fell into his arms, sobbing until the frost turned to dew. From that day forward, they stopped hiding. She worked the ranch beside him, mending fences, branding calves, hauling feed. When the neighbors passed by, she nodded and smiled, meeting their eyes without shame. If they whispered, let them. The prairie had seen worse things than love. Caleb never made big promises. He didn't have to. Every small gesture, a cup of coffee left by her hand before dawn, a blanket pulled up over her shoulders after a long day, spoke louder than vows. Love on the frontier wasn't made of poetry. It was made of calloused hands and quiet endurance. One evening, near Christmas, the first snow began to fall. The ranch looked softer somehow, blanketed in white. Inside, the fire crackled, filling the cabin with golden light. Clara sat sewing by the hearth, humming a tune she half remembered from her girlhood. Caleb came in from the barn, brushing snow off his coat. You look at peace, he said, smiling that rare, quiet smile she loved so much. I am, she replied, for the first time in years. He crossed to her, kneeling beside the chair. Clara, he said, his voice low, steady. You ever think about what comes next? She frowned, setting down the needle. Next? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring, plain, worn, shaped from the melted handle of an old spoon. Ain't much, he said softly, but I reckon it's enough if you'll take it. Her hands trembled as he held it out. For a moment, all the noise of her past, the shame, the fear, the whispers gone, came rushing back. And then she looked at him, the man who'd seen every scar and never turned away. Yes, she whispered. 100 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. Reckon that makes us even with the world, he murmured. It took enough from both of us. The months that followed were hard but full. Calving season, long rides, and laughter that came easier with each sunrise. Slowly, the town's gossip faded. People began to notice not the scandal but the steadiness. Caleb's ranch prospered, his cattle fat and healthy through spring. And when Clara walked beside him through the market, folks nodded again, cautious at first, then with respect. In time, even the preacher returned. He stopped by one Sunday afternoon, hat in hand, his voice awkward. Mr. and Mrs. Hart, he said, seems I misjudged what the Lord had in mind for you two. Caleb smiled faintly. Reckon the Lord don't mind us figuring it out our own way. When the preacher left, Clara laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. Mrs. Hart, she repeated softly, as if trying the name on her tongue for the first time. I could get used to that. Years later, people would tell stories about the quiet woman who'd tamed the hard cowboy of Red Hollow Ranch. But the truth was, she hadn't tamed him. She'd simply reminded him that his heart was still alive. And he, in turn, had given her a home when she'd thought herself unworthy of one. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the prairie grass, she'd stand on the porch and remember that night in the rain, the fear, the trembling, the whisper that had changed everything. Wrong, he'd said. Maybe. But so's living half dead. Now as the sun rose over their land, golden and wide and free, Clara smiled at the man beside her. Caleb slipped an arm around her waist, his touch still as gentle as the first time. You ever think about that night? She asked softly. He nodded. Every time I see you breathe. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The wind carried the scent of sage and wild roses across the fields, the same scent that had followed her the day she arrived. But now it didn't smell like running. It smelled like home. And in that endless western morning, beneath the sky that stretched farther than forgiveness itself, Clara finally knew the truth. Love wasn't about right or wrong. It was about choosing, even when the world said you shouldn't. And she would choose him again and again until the prairie itself forgot their names.